The American power system is regarded by many as the most magnificent machine ever built by man. Its development in the 20th century provided the bedrock for economic growth and truly the American century. And it's been our largest source of emissions reductions here in the early part of the 21st century. But as we look at the challenges going forward, I think there are real questions as to whether or not our ability to build a power sector which meets all of our needs are going to allow us to control the commanding heights of the 21st century. Our guest today is at the heart of these conversations in Washington. I am pleased to welcome former Secretary of Energy, now President and CEO of the Edison Electric Institute, Dan Brouillette, to CSIS.
Thank you, Joseph. Great to be with you.
Dan, I really do want to talk about the stakes of our policy challenge and our economic challenge with you today, because I feel, and I know that you and I have talked about this in the past, that our policymakers are sort of under-indexing on how important the power sector is going to be, how much change is going on in the sector today, and how important it is to maintain a reliable and affordable power system when we think about economic competitiveness and safety, national security. I'd love to just start with, how do you see the stakes over the next few years, the key decisions that our policymakers are going to be facing with respect to the power sector?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Joseph, and I appreciate the question. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank you for the great work that CSIS does each and every day in the energy space.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the good work. I really do count on you many days for advice and counsel, so thank you for that.
I'm always a little worried when people tell me they follow me on Twitter or read the stuff online, but I appreciate it.
No, you guys do great work. Look, I don't think I can overstate how important it is, to be honest. We've all seen the stories in the national newspapers, on TV and whatnot about the onset of AI, the use of AI by the public. We're very familiar now with the stat that, if you do a search on the internet and you use AI, it's roughly 10 times more electricity than the old versions of search. That's all true. It's going to place an enormous amount of load onto a grid that is quite robust. I've seen some stories that lead people to believe that it's old, it's antiquated, it's too small, it's this or it's that. I don't think that that's true. What is actually old and antiquated and in need of reform is the permitting process here in the United States. That's what really needs to be addressed. But to the fundamental question, as we all know, electricity, energy generally drives our economic activity. It is the foundation upon which almost all economic activity is built upon. So when we look at the infrastructure that's needed here in the United States, we need more of it. That's the simple answer. We need more of it. We don't need just more transmission or just more distribution. We need something to put on those wires. We need more generation as well. So as we look across this grid, as we look across this energy infrastructure, we now know that it will take all forms of energy to meet the economic demand that's coming on. It's going to take renewables. It's going to take natural gas. It's going to take more nuclear power. All of those things, more transmission towers need to be built, more distribution wires need to be laid. All of those things are necessary for us to meet this new demand. And, I might add, while we talked about AI and we talked about, some of the newer technologies, this is on top of what was already a growing demand for energy. So we're already behind the curve, if you will, and we really need to get busy quickly.
Yeah, this question of AI to me is really interesting. And I know it's a moving target as to how much that's going to grow the power sector. But the numbers we see coming out of NERC, the numbers we see coming out of utilities around the country for just how much load they're expecting to see in a very compressed timeline are kind of galling, to be honest. How much do you think that's the AI kind of is an additional factor, is just compressing a problem we already had, that like the permitting structures are too slow, that the interconnection queue is getting too long? Or is it kind of going to fundamentally or qualitatively change how the industry needs to build over the next few years?
No, it's exacerbating a problem that was already there.
Yeah.
So if you look at the FERC, the latest FERC report, it says that we're about 38 gigawatts short by 2028, I think is the year in which they said that. There is some AI incorporated into that analysis, But if you stripped out AI, you would still see a shortfall. And that's, again, the restrictions that are being placed today on a very important industry.
Right.
There's a message out there, there's a feeling out there that somehow the utilities, the electric companies are moving too slowly on this transmission build out, on this infrastructure build out. Nothing could be further from the truth. In many respects, they're being constrained by this permitting process that we have here in the United States, as well as a litigation process that seems to be in certain parts of the country very disruptive.
So, if we think about you go back into history, there was a period of very rapid power sector growth, 1950 to 1970.
Sure.
I grew up in the West. I mean, large urban areas now exist because we were building the power sector so quickly and electrifying. Then things slowed, and then for the last 20 years, we've really been in a period of almost no growth. We're now kind of coming back into the growth space. Do you think the proposals that you're seeing in Congress related to permitting reform are enough to meet this potential growth, or are we in a position where we're going to lose out on opportunities if we don't get that piece of the equation correct?
Yeah, it's not enough. I think Congress took a good first step in the last funding package that they passed, but much more is needed. We need to fundamentally address NEPA here in the United States, the National Environmental Policy Act. A very, very important law. But seriously abused in the process here within Washington, D.C. And there are some simple steps that we can take, and the administration has taken one or two, but there's so much more to do. For instance, you don't need 3 or 4 agencies doing a NEPA analysis when you apply for a permit for whatever piece of infrastructure you want to build. If one can do it and can do it well, then the other agencies, EPA, FERC, the DOE, others, should be able to rely on that analysis. Let's just streamline that part of the process. Again, they've taken a first step, probably a lot more we can do in that regard. But I think, as I think about, where we need to head as a country, the investment is there. The capital is there to build this. There's some incentives in the new laws that were recently passed, tax credits to help incentivize or catalyze some additional infrastructure. The only thing that stands in the way right now is a political will to address these permitting issues. If we can get there, if we can get some political agreement on the process and moving it forward, then I think we're going to meet all of that economic demand that we just talked about, and we can go well beyond. And we know how to do this. That's the other thing, Joseph, that when I listen to the conversation around the country, it seems like we've lost our sense of history. So we're talking now about AI and other things consuming perhaps 8 to 10% of the nation's electricity demand, which is a big number, but it's not unprecedented. Back in the 50s, as you mentioned, that time frame, we were building out the weapons program here in the United States as part of the Cold War. We were building warheads. The process that we used to enrich uranium at that point in time was known as gaseous diffusion. It consumed about 10% of the nation's electricity demand at that point in time.
Oh, did it really?
It did.
Oh, it's like the new AI. It's like AI is the new gaseous diffusion.
What's new is old, what's old is new, full circle.
Well, that actually raises what I think is an interesting question, in that a lot of policymakers in Washington are concerned about economic competition, in particular with China. And being at the forefront of these key new, call them strategic technologies, AI, advanced manufacturing, seems like it is a question of, can we build a power sector that those companies want to buy out of and can afford to use without sacrificing reliability? How much is economic competition a motivating factor here?
Well, I think it's very high. I mean, we do want those jobs here. We do want that economic activity here in the United States. One, because it does create the jobs, and the economic benefits of that are important to the American people. So obviously we want those here in the United States. But it's also connected to our national security, as you well know. Post-pandemic, we're looking at supply chain issues. We're looking at, still struggling in certain industries with supply chain. This happens to be one of them. Today, there's about a 3 to 5 year wait for things like large transformers. Very, very important that we move some of that manufacturing back here in the United States. But I think, as I think about it, all of those things require electricity. All of those things require additional energy. So in order to capture that economic goal, we have to build out the infrastructure first here in the United States. But it is an important component. I mean, it's important for our trade, it's important for our foreign policy. There's a number of different factors that go into these decisions.
You know, you mentioned transmission. I wholeheartedly agree. And one of the things that's very interesting about the power sector is like it largely arranges itself, right? There's plenty of capital out in the United States to fund this kind of stuff. It's the linkages where we're seeing kind of bottlenecks and slowdowns. One of those is transmission.
Yeah.
In particular, interregional transmission, right? The dream of bringing electrons from around the world to around the country, to meet the needs of demand centers wherever they may be. In part, transmission also creates economic opportunity. You build transmission to new places and suddenly you can see lots of generation get built, and on the other side you can see a lot of consumption happen. FERC just passed a rule, issued a new rulemaking on trying to do some forward planning with respect to transmission. The Department of Energy has a sort of newly reconstituted authority with respect to national interest energy transmission corridors. What is your view on the role of the federal government in building out transmission, and how do we actually make it work? It seems like it's often a very political conversation, and maybe invariably. So how do we get over the sort of the challenges of land use and who pays to really realize a net benefit for the country?
Yeah. Well, you just touched on it at the very end. It's who pays. So the transmission grid itself and interregional transmission, moving the electron from point A to point B. You know, we have some really, really talented people here in the United States, and they're so innovative. You know, when they're dealing with these issues, we know how to do that part. The question is, you know, we have a state regulatory system in addition to the federal regulatory system. The question is, who pays for that infrastructure? Currently, it goes through an electric company, utility. It's passed along in a rate base. All the consumers who benefit from that transmission help pay for it over a long period of time, typically 10, 20, 30, 40 years. That these things are paid out over, so that you don't have all those costs borne up front. That's the important question. So when we think about building out new transmission systems, it's important for us to recognize the role that utilities are playing today in that marketplace and what consumers have already bought and are still paying for in so many respects. And that's where the FERC rule comes in. We think that they did some good things in this rule. It's 1920 is the order number. They've done some good things in recognizing the long duration or the longer time frames that are needed to plan these projects. But we hope that they come back and look at some of the other provisions. In particular, there is a right of first refusal. Right of first refusal. And what that does is it recognizes that, you know, what I just mentioned, what the utilities have already bought, what the utilities have already allocated to the consumers, consumers are already paying for. And it gives them the option, if a new transmission line is to be built, to look at that project and perhaps incorporate it into that rate base that's already existing. So we hope that they come back and they take a look at those provisions. We think that they missed an opportunity with the rule. So we'll see what they do. But, you know, the more fundamental question is, does the government have a role? Yes, they do. These are important projects. They're very expensive. And you want this to be done in an equitable way. So if a new transmission line is going to come through my backyard, for instance, you know, the consumer is going to ask the obvious question, what benefit do I get from that? And if the answer is zero, then your chances of getting permits or getting approvals to site that infrastructure is probably pretty low. So,
yeah, I really feel that there's I think the sense that there's a national purpose to building out transmission actually would help in this regard, because there are so many veto points. And you know, I totally respect that we need to make sure that the payment is fair and who pays for this infrastructure and whose energy choices are being reflected is an important part of the conversation. But I almost feel that, like, if the pie is growing so much, this is not a zero-sum game, right? We're trying to add a lot of economic opportunity. And we just need a little bit more of a forward vision. Not to discount the fact that you need a fair allocation, but I do get the sense that if we really want to seize the moment, we sort of need a national consensus that this kind of stuff is worthy of investment.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think it is worthy on economic grounds, but, you know, as we mentioned earlier, it's also worthy from our national security standpoint.
Totally.
And I think, you know, the identification of critical infrastructure, the identification of certain components within our energy infrastructure as being important to our foreign policy and our national security. If we could have the government designate those more formally and work with the electric companies to protect those or accommodate additional growth of those, those are the kinds of things that I think is an appropriate role for the federal government to play. And obviously they have to do that in coordination and concert with state regulators, but nonetheless, that's a good role.
Right. And that leads to a whole new set of analytical tasks for people like CSIS trying to figure out what is the security premium we want to pay when we're thinking about the grid, and what kind of investments do we want to add on that side.
Yeah, no, it is, and it's something that we have to agree as an American people. You know, as a nation, we have to say that that's important. Much like we do with the DoD, or with the production of tanks or nuclear warheads or whatever, what may have you, that protects us and provides or protects the freedoms that we all enjoy. The energy system is equally important. So when the lights go out and you don't have access to Wi-Fi, that means in many cases in post-pandemic world, in a remote environment, that means you're not working today, which often means you're not getting paid today. So I mean, it's economic security as well as national security, but we have to bring these together and decide as an American people, as a public, what is it that we're willing to do.
How is it that you personally or at EAEI, how do you all think about the sort of binning of these different risks and considerations? I mean, you've got, like, reliability is at the heart, right? Like, turn the switch, lights need to go on. Resilience, meaning like the ability of the system to deal with new strain, is kind of equally important, right? You don't want a storm to knock out a large portion of the power grid. Then you've got the sort of competitiveness and strategic angle that we were talking about, right? The ability to just produce a lot of power, to produce it ever cleaner, is part of economic competition in the 21st century.
That's correct.
How should we, how do you think about binning those different things? How do we achieve all those priorities?
Well, we look at it as a 3 or 4-legged stool. So it's reliability, resilience, affordability, and of course environmental stewardship at the same time. So reliability and resilience are often lumped together or conflated. So it can be a 3 or 4-legged stool. But the bottom line is that they're all important. The question is, where are you on the spectrum, and where are you on the timetable? What's most important today? And I think right now, what I hear from consumers across the country and from the companies that we represent is that affordability and reliability are the top 2 concerns. So for the moment, those are rising in our priority list. And we're not losing sight for a second of the important goals around 2030 or 2050. This industry's done a great job of reducing its emissions. They're now roughly about 40%, reduced about 40% from what they were in 2005. So they've made tremendous progress on that score. We want to capture that and continue it, but at the same time, we also want to make sure that we don't stifle that type of progress by having prices go too high. So affordability is very important. So as we think about new infrastructure projects, how you finance them, over what period of time, what are those costs to consumers? All of those factors become more and more important as well. But the fundamental regulatory compact that we have is to keep the lights on. So that's always at the top of the list.
I'm so glad you brought up that intersection of reliability and affordability. I mean, one concern I have, everything is expensive these days.
Because energy is expensive.
Well, and inflation is we're in an inflationary environment, and people get more and more sensitive to cost increases when everything else is more expensive, right? The DOE has tried to emphasize the role that demand response and conservation can play as part of a whole package. How do you, and then transmission is a long-term solution, building more generation is necessary. How do you see all those tools working together to make sure consumers get good value? And is the industry ready to really provide a sort of full spectrum of tools for consumers?
Yeah, no, I think they are, and they have. So I mean, if you look across the country, what you'll see in these various companies are remarkable energy efficiency programs. Through demand response mechanisms, or in other cases, there's other technologies that are available to people. They're all needed because, as we mentioned earlier, FERC says we're roughly 38 gigawatts short by 2028. Without those technologies, without those energy efficiency technologies, I don't know what the number would be exactly, but it would be larger than 38 gigawatts. So we need those technologies in place just to help us meet the demand.
Yeah.
So the industry is very supportive of those things, and we're going to continue to develop them alongside of our research partners at the DOE National Laboratories or EPRI, which is a partner to our industry.
I'll also note that the gap gets larger if you start thinking about continuing plant closures, which we can talk about in a minute.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, but as older infrastructure gets shut down and we're having trouble building new stuff, that gap in capacity gets a lot larger.
It's called alligator jaws. It just gets wider and wider.
The one thing I want to touch on is also reliability in the transition. EEI is actually taking a pretty firm stance on this new rule from the EPA. I'm happy to hear your thoughts on that, but I also want to hear your long-term view, right? Is there a middle path for making sure we can build enough generation of the right kinds to provide reliable power and make progress toward a net zero world, right? And what are the places where you think we've under-indexed and we need to lean in? Be it nuclear, carbon capture and storage, long duration storage, enhanced geothermal, whatever it may be.
Yeah, we're under-indexed on nuclear power, in my view. It's my personal view. From my time as Secretary of Energy, we could see it very clearly that we had become dependent, for instance, on Russia for nuclear fuel sourcing, enrichment primarily. That's a challenge for us as America. So we have to address that squarely. And I think if we do, we enhance our national security, we become less dependent on Russia, obviously. But we also provide that firm baseload power, which is really the underpinning for our electricity grid today. Nuclear power provides what is called baseload or firm, 24/7. It's constantly running, and it runs for a very long period of time, just like natural gas, just like coal in many respects. So we need that in order to meet this demand. It also, helps us bring on more renewable power, which is sort of the conundrum or the irony, if you will, about renewable power. It is dependent at this point in time upon baseload power being provided. So if we retire those natural gas facilities too quickly, and I think the case of the EPA rule, it would in fact do that. It would force the retirement of many natural gas generating facilities today.
Or they might not get built, right, for the new source.
For new equipment, they may not ever get built. But for older equipment, it will shut them down because they're just going to retire. They're going to retire over the lifespan in which they're due to retire. And that's a challenge for us. I mean, we really, as a nation, should be very concerned about that. As we look at the demand, we look at our ability to meet the demand today, we're on a razor's edge. And it doesn't take much to tip it one way or the other, which is why we see brownouts and blackouts in parts of the country.
I actually do feel for a lot of our colleagues who work at in the regional transmission organizations or work at NERC, they sort of have this boy cries wolf problem, right? Where it's like, it's their job to be worried about this. So they're sort of constantly worried about it. But now that, the wolf might be kind of at the door. Do you get a sense of
the wolf's at the door. There's no question. The wolf's at the door. There's no question. I mean, we can talk about it all day. The bottom line is it's right there on the other side of the door. And we saw that 2 or 3 or 4 years ago in the storms that came through Boston. We were literally within, seconds or minutes away from losing the grid. We saw it in Texas. We've seen it in California. We've seen it in other parts of the country. The fact that it's happening should be a red flag to everyone in the country today. We really are on the razor's edge here.
There's 2 more things I want to talk to you about, though now I've worked myself into a great state of worry. The other is about supply chains, which you did mention already, the kind of the delays with respect to transformers. We also have, across a variety of sectors, a lot of efforts, both from the private sector and from the government, to diversify supply chains, to de-risk from China, decouple in some areas at the same time. I feel like the power sector we don't give enough attention to for all the equipment necessary to maintain it and build it in the way that you and I have already been discussing. So when you think about transformers and inverters and batteries and all the things of the modern grid, how are you and how are the industry thinking about de-risking our supply chain so that we can meet our goals?
Well, there's a number of different ways. I mean, so we are diversifying the supply chain. So we're looking at other manufacturers around the world. We're sourcing things from different countries. We're sourcing things that we feel comfortable from countries that have good relations with the United States, or at least we can forecast will not have bad relations, over
Right.
the course of the next few years. That's very important. The industry's doing a great job of that. Can we do more? Yes, we need
Yeah.
to do more. We're also looking at newer technologies that make us less dependent on some of these types of equipment. So, those are the more what I would refer to as blue sky moments, where we're looking at science, we're looking at research and development, and trying to develop infrastructure that may not be as dependent upon China, for instance, for transformer manufacturing.
Yeah.
I'm aware of a few projects that are ongoing right now in the DOE National Laboratory that are quite interesting. The ability to move electricity perhaps without wires. So think about what that world would look like.
Hey, there
We
you
just
go.
talked a lot about transmission and
Right.
infrastructure development. What if we can move electrons without a wire at all? Those are the kinds of things that the industry is working very closely, either through EPRI or directly with the U.S. Department of Energy to help advance and just see what we might be able to develop. All of that makes us less dependent upon the current supply chain.
And do you think that, is that another area where the wolf is kind of at the door, or are those efforts going to yield enough resilience that we need to, that we should, I don't want to say lean back, but that we'll be in a comfortable place? Because sometimes I worry that, if supply, we get another kind of COVID type situation or geopolitical conflict, we really could be in a troubling state.
Yeah, no, I think, I don't want to suggest that everything is, safe and sound and fine.
But manageable?
It's manageable. And we have to be ever diligent and ever, aware of what's going on around us. The adversary never sleeps. But we feel like we can manage most of what we have today.
Right.
If you think about things like cybersecurity, there's so many things that we're doing as an industry or individual companies are doing to protect their customers, to protect their businesses, that really do mitigate the risk to a large degree.
Yeah.
Is it ever all gone? Perhaps
Right.
not, but that's why we, work 24/7.
Lastly, I can't let you out of here without asking about the policy outlook for 2025. We have there's an election this year.
Yeah.
We're coming off an administration that's taken really big swings particularly on power sector issues. The future of the Inflation Reduction Act is a big question. What are your thoughts on the policy discussion for next year? There's a potential tax bill. What areas are what's EEI watching as you think about the coming years?
Well, we're clearly going to be a part of the tax conversation that occurs in 2025. And to the extent it relates to the IRA, we're going to be looking very closely at those tax credits. We're very supportive of certain credits within the IRA, and we want to protect those. So the technology neutral credits, for instance, that allow the development of these technologies very efficiently, in terms of capital, we want to protect those. And we're supportive of the notion that some of these can be done through credits rather than grants.
Yeah.
So, from a policy perspective, credits, you have to have economic activity. You have to create an income in order to have a credit against a tax that may be due to that income. Those are the right approaches, we feel. So we want to protect those. And whether or not that goes away, probably too early to tell. But the question I get asked most often is if Mr. Biden's not reelected, Mr. Trump is elected, does all of this go away overnight? And the answer to that is no.
Right.
Takes a very long time to get a statute or get a bill passed through Congress. Has to go to the president's desk. You know the process very well.
Yep.
There is a large portion of the IRA that is actually very consistent with the policies that the President Trump, directed me to undertake as
Support
secretary.
nuclear.
Yeah.
Do carbon capture.
And hydrogen.
And hydrogen. There you go.
Those are all programs that were part and parcel to the Trump energy policy. So I would suspect that there'll be support for that.
Yeah, and in any case, I mean, I've been thinking more and more about this sort of mega tax bill. I do actually think we sort of underthought how do you get the same bang for less buck in a world where government spending is just more challenging now, and there's going to be a lot of competing priorities.
Yeah.
We'd be happy to work with you on that front because I think there's going to be
I'd be happy to work with you as well.
There's going to be a lot of need on there.
Yeah, there will be.
Dan, you have such an interesting background: military service, government service, private sector leader. I'd love to hear you're at the helm of EEI. This is I think one of the most important industries for our country, and more so now than it has been in the recent past. What are the big projects that you think we need to work on? What are the things that are keeping you up at night, and what are you most excited about?
What keeps me up at night is our inability to move the product from where it's produced to where it needs to be in the marketplace.
Yeah.
It's what we just talked about. I saw it in the natural gas industry when I was running an operating company and building LNG facilities. The biggest challenge there was infrastructure.
Yep.
It was getting the natural gas to the water through a pipeline, not enough pipeline capacity. Same thing exists here. We know how to produce the electron, getting it to the market in which wants it, where the load is very difficult here in the United States. We have to improve upon that. So that's what I see as the biggest challenge, and it's our biggest opportunity as well. I mean, as we just talked about, the economic return on that is enormous.
Yep.
The environmental return is enormous. The national security return is enormous. We have to do this. We're in America. We know how to do these things. Let's just get busy doing them.
Right. Well, why don't we get busy doing them today? We've exhausted our half hour. I do have to say thank you for coming. I think your voice is so important in this conversation here in Washington and around the world. And the need for U.S. leadership in developing a modern, clean, resilient, larger power sector could not be more obvious. So thank you so much for your work, Dan, and we really appreciate that you joined us here today.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you, and thank you for your good work as well. Your voice is important. So
much obliged. Yeah. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Yes.
And to those who've joined us online, we're so grateful for your attention. Please check out all the material and work we're doing in this area on our website, and we always welcome your comments and suggestions. This is Joseph Mikett signing off for CSIS.